Hi everyone, welcome back to another lecture. So today we are going to start with PowerPoint 9, right? Because of course we finished PowerPoint 8 last time. Last time we of course focused on runaway slaves and what they had to go through in order to seek their freedom. So we talked about William and Ellen Craft and how Ellen Craft, being a white passing woman, dressed as a slave master, and her husband were able to successfully run away in plain sight. We talked about the Underground Railroad and that how that complex system that is not a literal Underground Railroad helped many slaves escape through volunteers. Um, we also talked about Harriet Tubman, the most famous conductor from the Underground Railroad, and sort of how she freed hundreds of slaves throughout. And we also finished out the we also finished out the PowerPoint by talking about Sojourner Truth and how she not only sued for her son's freedom, but she also escaped and made speeches on behalf of women's rights. So today we're going to talk about how the abolitionists tried to free people. Remember, I mentioned abolitionism several times and how it was basically the movement that fought to free the slaves. So that's why this is called Reform Impulse. So firstly, we're going to talk about the Second Great Awakening, right? We discussed the First Great Awakening a little bit way back in our lectures, but there was a Second Great Awakening because people felt during the antebellum period that people weren't as religious as they used to be, that there was a need to sort of reconnect with the Christian God. And here's a picture of one of those Great Awakening gatherings where basically preachers would tour the country. They'd set up sort of these events and they would preach to those who attended. Now, occasionally these go on still throughout our country, but they're not really publicized. So if you take a look at video A, there's another Crash Course History video. Please pay attention to when you click on the video, I have told you where to start from so you don't have to watch the whole video. If you want to, that's fine. It generally talks about reform movements during this time, but again, you don't have to watch all of it. And here is another picture of a Great Awakening sort of service, and you see a lot of women's sort of in attendance, falling down and getting on their knees and stuff, sort of feeling what the preacher is saying. So revival's and perfectionist hopes of improving individuals and society continued to increase from 1840 to 1865, aka pretty much the antebellum period, across all major denominations, especially in urban areas. Evangelists often directly addressed issues such as slavery, greed, and poverty, laying the groundwork for later reform movements. An evangelist is a person who seeks to convert others to the Christian faith, especially by public preaching. Now, alcohol was a huge thing that they were against because I don't know if I've mentioned this in this class yet, but often alcohol meant, especially during the Industrial Revolution where there were a lot of factories, a lot of men would come home from the factories after working 7 days a week, 12 plus hours a day. They would go to the bars and spend all their money, buy alcohol, and they come home and with no money, and some would beat their wives and children. So, plus, religious fanatics believe that the Bible does not encourage drinking, although there's a lot of mention of wine and liquors, things like that in the Bible, but they believed you shouldn't drink. So there were huge movements against alcohol consumption. The influence of the awakening continued in the form of more secular movements. In the midst of shifts in theology and church polity, American Christians began progressive movements to reform society during this period. So additionally, they felt that society in general was getting too corrupt and that their perfect ideal of a Christian society needed work in order to happen. Known commonly as antebellum reform, this phenomenon included reforms against the consumption of alcohol, as I mentioned, women's rights, for women's rights, and the abolition of slavery. Interest in transforming the world was applied to mainstream political action as temperance activists, anti-slavery advocates, and proponents of other variations of reform sought to implement their beliefs into national politics. While Protestant religion had previously played an important role on the American political scene, the Second Great Awakening strengthened the role it would play. So basically, the most important thing we can take away from the Second Great Awakening with regards to our course is that it really put their ideals in politics, specifically abolitionism. Now, abolitionists were already in politics, but this sort of showed our politicians, like, hey, the people really want slavery to be gone. Like, this is an issue that they're very concerned about. Here's another preacher. So you didn't have to have a big crowd. You could just get up on your soapbox or carton or something else, whatever, a box, and basically preach or evangelize to anybody who's around you. Now, we mentioned that the slaves often had to do this because they didn't have formal areas to worship unless they were free, but the white preachers did this as well with farm workers, as you can see here. Now, next we're going to talk about the foremost white abolitionist during this time, and his name was William Lloyd Garrison. Okay, this is what he looked like. Now we're getting photography so we can kind of see what these people actually look like in real life. So William Lloyd Garrison was born December 10th, 1805, and eventually died on May 24th, 1879. So his life is interesting because he was only born a couple years after the cotton boom and the Louisiana Purchase, right, with Thomas Jefferson, and he ended up dying shortly after the Reconstruction period, which is when we're going to end our course. So he got to see a lot of what our class is talking about just by living, which is interesting. If you take a look at video B, there's a short biography on William Lloyd Garrison's life. So he was a prominent American abolitionist, journalist, suffragist, meaning that he supported women's rights, and social reformer. He is best known as the editor of the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator, which he founded with Isaac Knapp in 1831 and published in Massachusetts until slavery was abolished. He was one of the founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which we will talk about next, and promoted immediate emancipation of slaves in the United States. So William Lloyd Garrison did not believe in gradual emancipation, right? That thing we talked about previously with regards to the North wanting to free their slaves over time. He believed that slavery should stop right now, no delays, it's bad. So he was considered pretty radical by other abolitionists. Born in Newburyport, Massachusetts, Garrison began his newspaper career as an apprentice compositor for the Newburyport Herald. He became involved in the anti-slavery movement in the 1820s, and over time he rejected both the American Colonization Society, remember that society we talked about that wanted to send black people back to Africa, and the gradualist views of most others involved in the movement. Garrison co-founded The Liberator to espouse his abolitionist views, and in 1832 he organized the New England Anti-Slavery Society. This society expanded into the American Anti-Slavery Society, which again we're going to talk about next. Garrison also emerged as a leading advocate of women's rights, which prompted a split in the abolitionist community. So the arguments for or against women joining were a huge point of contention for the male members of the abolitionist movement. Often their societies or groups would split because some wanted women to be in their leadership and to fight for women, and others did not. So fortunately, William Lloyd Garrison was on the right side of history and supported women. In the 1870s, Garrison became a prominent voice for the women's suffrage movement. He became famous as one of the most articulate as well as most radical opponents of slavery. He approached emancipation by stressing moral suasion, nonviolence, and passive resistance. Moral suasion means basically you appeal to someone's morals, right? So, like, for just as an extreme example, right? If you were kidnapped by somebody and they're like, have a gun to your face, they're going to kill you, you would sort of try to appeal to their morals or their humanity, and you would maybe like use their name. So, like, hey, you don't want to do this, you don't want to do this. Like, you would say stuff about your life and say, hey, my name is blah, blah, blah. I have 2 kids, I have whatever, just basically trying to get them to feel guilty, right? Appeal to their morals. So that's what he tried to do with slavery. He's like, don't you guys believe people should be free? Don't you believe children should be with their parents, right? So he'd make those type of arguments. Okay, here's another photograph of him. While some other abolitionists of the time favored gradual emancipation, Garrison argued for immediate and complete emancipation of all the slaves, as we talked about, right? But this is important to stress because, again, like, it's considered to be the most radical. If you guys don't know what radical means, radical is basically like you're extreme, right? You're definitely on one polar opposite side than the other, right? On July 4th, 1854, he publicly burned a copy of the Constitution, condemning it as a covenant with death, an agreement with hell, referring to the compromise that had written slavery into the Constitution. So remember that whole lecture we did about the Constitution? He hated it. He hated all that stuff. In 1855, his 8-year alliance with Frederick Douglass disintegrated when Douglass converted to a political abolitionist view that the document should be interpreted as being anti-slavery. So this whole debate with the Constitution that we talked about, it split him and his BFF, Frederick Douglass, who I think we're talking about next time, up, which sucks, right? Because Frederick Douglass was, of course, the foremost black abolitionist, black male abolitionist during this time. Garrison's outspoken anti-slavery views repeatedly put him in danger. Besides his imprisonment in Baltimore and the price placed on his head by the state of Georgia, Georgia's pretty famous for putting high-priced bounties on people's heads, he was the object of frequent death threats, both him and his family. So he really fought for the cause. Fortunately, he got to live the rest of his life without being murdered for his views, but, it was tough. And we'll talk about with Frederick Douglass, it was even tougher for a black man to be in this position, right? Because he didn't have any whiteness to fall back on to protect him. But William Lloyd Garrison did a lot. And here is a copy of The Liberator, Garrison's newspaper. Actually, when he was a kid and he worked for that one newspaper I told you about, they used to put pee on the paper, right? It was supposed to, like, preserve or do something or make the paper easier to write on, like, way back in the early 1800s, right? So, pretty gross. That's why I tell my students, you don't really want to time travel because everything was gross. Like, their sense of hygiene was terrible. So I don't think you want to smell the past. Okay, so next we're going to talk about Garrison's Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded in 1833 and concluded in 1870. Okay, but in general, right, number one, it kind of continued past slavery, so it was a little bit past its prime. And also, Garrison split pretty quickly from the society too, and we'll talk about why that is. But you can see in this picture some members of this anti-slavery society, and you can see women are there as well. One woman, the woman who has her head covered, is named Lucretia Mott, and we'll talk about her when we talk about female abolitionists next time. So the American Anti-Slavery Society was an abolitionist society founded by William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Tappan. Frederick Douglass was a key leader of the society who often spoke at its meetings. William Wells Brown was also a freed slave who often spoke at meetings. So they had black people in the society, whereas the American Colonization Society, that was sending black people to Liberia, didn't really have black leaders. By 1838, the society had 1,350 local chapters with around 250,000 members. That's quite a lot. Our population wasn't as big as it is now, so it was a lot of people. The society was considered controversial and sometimes met with violence. Its anti-slavery activities frequently met with violent public opposition, with mobs invading meetings, attacking speakers, and burning presses. So people really didn't like the society because they were fighting against slavery. In the mid-1830s, slavery had become so economically involved in the U.S. that getting rid of it would have caused a major blow to the economy, especially in the South. We've kind of discussed this before. The new American Anti-Slavery Society charged William Lloyd Garrison with writing the organization's new declaration. The document condemns the institution of slavery and accuses slave owners of the sin of being a man-stealer. Actually, whenever I say that, it reminds me of the song Man-Eater by Hall & Oates. If you haven't heard that song, listen to it because it is a bop, but it just makes me think about it. It calls for the immediate abolition of slavery without terms and is critical of the efforts of the American Colonization Society. At the same time, it declares the group to be pacifist, and the signers agree, if necessary, to die as martyrs. So they literally signed this, not in blood, but kind of metaphorically, and said, we are not afraid to die for the cause, right? Many founding members used a practical approach to slavery, saying economically it did not make sense. Wright used the rhetoric of religion to elicit sympathy toward African Americans and presented slavery as a moral sin, sort of like we just talked about with Garrison. In 1939, the national organization split over basic differences of approach. Garrison and his followers were more radical than other members. They denounced the U.S. Constitution as supportive of slavery, were against established religion, and insisted on sharing organizational responsibility with women. Okay, so all of these things split the society. And here is their sort of logo, right? Proclaim liberty to all the inhabitants. A minority of anti-feminist delegates who were more moderate on many issues left the society, forming the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. Wright was among them. They were more conservative, supporting organized religion and traditional forms of governance and excluding women from leadership. So basically, they were like, we got to bring Christianity and stuff into this. No women should be with us, right? We don't need to change the government. We just want to get rid of slavery. These types of differences, especially with regards to religion, will split the women's rights movement a couple decades after the Civil War, right? The women's rights movement will argue, well, some of them like certain amendments, some don't, some are more Christian, some don't like that, this is like a point of contention. And this is the one of the meeting cards, right? So of course maybe you would advertise this in the newspaper, but again, the society was so hated that they didn't really want to do that. You didn't have like email, pagers, cell phones, whatever. Like maybe you have a phone. No, not really. Actually, the phone I don't think was invented yet, right? So you can't really reach out to people too much. So you basically have to go and get a meeting card, or someone would deliver a meeting card to you, and you'd show up on that day. I think the telephone was invented in the late 1800s, yeah. By Alexander Graham Bell. You maybe didn't want to or care about hearing about that, but I'm going to say it. So our last topic for today is a black man who a lot of people don't really know about. But during this time, he was super, super brave, and he wrote a document that basically tried to get black people to fight for their freedom. Okay, and this man's name is David Walker. and we are going to discuss his appeal as the final topic for today. And here's a drawing of Walker when he was younger. David Walker was born on September 28, 1796, and he died on August 6, 1830. So he didn't live that long, and he didn't get to see the Emancipation Proclamation or anything, which sucks. He's an abolitionist, writer, and anti-slavery activist. Though his father was a slave, his mother was free, therefore he was free as well. Remember, in 1668, they said, if your mother, you take on the status of your mother. So if your mother was a free black person, guess what? You're a free black person too. In September 1829, Walker published his appeal to African Americans, entitled Walker's Appeal in 4 articles, together with the preamble to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America. It's a very long title. I definitely shortened that for you guys. Written in Boston on September 28, 1829, so 1 year before he died. We're going to read the document next. The purpose of the document was to encourage readers to take an active role in fighting for their oppression, regardless of the risk, and to press white Americans to realize the moral and religious failures of slavery. So he was appealing to both white and black people to get this solved. The appeal brought attention to the abuses and inequalities of slavery and the responsibility of individuals to act according to religious and political principles. Many abolitionists thought Walker's views were extreme. But historians cite the appeal as an influential political and social document of the 19th century. So this is a very important document in history. Walker exerted a radicalizing influence on the abolitionist movements of his day and inspired future black leaders and activists. Southern officials worked to prevent the appeal from reaching its residents. Blacks in Charleston and New Orleans were arrested for distributing the pamphlet, while authorities in Savannah, Georgia instituted a ban on the disembarkment of black seamen. So basically, they did not want this pamphlet to be spread. They were like, oh my God, this might cause us trouble, right? Because this was around the time, too, I think, of the Haitian Revolution. So if you take a look at video C, you will see David Walker's appeal read by Daryl from the rap group Run DMC, which is pretty cool. All right, let's read some of this before we continue. Although I already sort of went over a couple of the next notes, but So here is an excerpt from Walker's appeal. Said the whites want slaves and want us for their slaves, but some of them will curse the day they ever saw us. As true as the sun ever shone in its meridian splendor, my color will root some of them out of the very face of the earth. They shall have enough of making slaves of, and butchering, and murdering us in the manner which they have. No doubt some may say that I write with a bad spirit, and that I, being a black, wish these things to occur. Whether I write with a bad or a good spirit, I say if these things do not occur in their proper time, it is because the world in which he lived does not exist, and we are deceived with regard to his existence. It is immaterial, however, to me, who believe or who refuse, though I should like to see the whites repent, pre-adventure God may have mercy on them. Some, however, have gone so far that their cup must be filled. So basically he's saying that the ideal world where these injustices don't occur doesn't exist yet. He is saying that some white people can be saved, right, from the immoral things that they've been doing, but some have gone too far. Okay, so this is very radicalizing, right? You're also calling out the butchering and torture of slaves, right? You're calling it for what it is, instead of just being like, oh yeah, because people try to sort of sugarcoat slavery to feel less bad, how the founding fathers omitted the word slave and slavery from the Constitution and the Declaration, even though they implied it, right? So here's a cover of Walker's appeal from the time. Okay, and we just talked about how he was considered to be very extreme, and that Black Americans were arrested and kept from traveling in the South so that they wouldn't distribute this particular document. Despite such efforts, Walker's pamphlet was widespread by early 1830. Having failed to contain the appeal, Southern officials criticized both the pamphlet and its author. Newspapers like the Richmond Enquirer railed against what it called Walker's monstrous slander of the region. Outrage over the appeal even led Georgia to announce an award of $10,000 to anyone who could hand over Walker alive, and $1,000 to anyone who would kill him. However, Walker died the following year from tuberculosis. Okay. So, the state of Georgia, right, who put a bounty on William Lloyd Garrison, right, they put $10,000 down for David Walker. It's crazy, right? I mean, it sucks that he couldn't live longer to write more appeals and to maybe he would have changed things a little bit more, encouraged more Black leaders to come forward. But this document really stands the test of time. It's great. It's a great thing to talk about in this PowerPoint as well. And here is what another sort of depiction of what Walker's appeal looked like. You can see a Black man sort of praising the heavens on the left. So that's it for today. Next time we are going to discuss Frederick Douglass, who I mentioned several times, and who President Trump a few years ago, or a couple years ago, thought that he was still alive, which is impossible. We will also be finishing out this PowerPoint by talking about women who joined the abolitionist movement, because a lot of women did at the time. Then we will be opening the 10th PowerPoint by discussing our idea of Southern expansion and also a provision that was proposed when we defeated Mexico in 1848. So we're kind of start talking about the Mexican-American War.